Well, hello again. This is Ibrahim Sundiata, former chair of history at Howard University, former chair of African and African American Studies at Brandeis University, and former Du Bois Fellow at Harvard University. Now, in the news right now, because of the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, TV is abuzz with discussions. I watch a lot of TV and I watch a lot of talking heads. And so there is a feeling that really higher education in this country has suffered because of the prohibition of race-based affirmative action. And I am in accord with that. My view may be a little different than other people's. I often go abroad and I speak to people who are to the left of most Americans, including so-called American progressives. And what I mean is they talk about class, which American progressives don't very much, especially black ones, to be direct. But I believe in affirmative action because it integrates or attempts to integrate power structure. I'm going back to words from the 70s where people said, we don't need all this integration stuff. We have to build black communities, etc. Well, yes, but we also need, and then you talked about the power structure. The power structure was against us. And then some people said, well, yeah, but we can integrate it. People like Vernon Jordan, people like as different as Richard Nixon of blessed memory, black capitalism. But there was this idea that you could keep, and there is this idea that, okay, the revolution did not happen in the 1960s. It didn't happen really in the 1970s. It's not going to happen. So we have this power structure, and it is in place. I have relatives and friends who are highly placed in corporate America, in academia, etc. And they would not have gotten there without affirmative action. I'm not saying that they don't have the smarts. They are some of the smartest people I know, but affirmative action opened the door. It opened the door. And with the door closing, there will be fewer and fewer and fewer African Americans at the table. Now, African Americans at the table, I think, given the fact that we're not having basic structural change, I think it's important. I don't think it's the only thing, but if we get rid of it, then we have African Americans more isolated as a permanent caste. And I believe African Americans are a caste. Yes, residentially segregated by custom and formally by law, endogamous, in marrying, and poorer, earning less. Black families have less than, a quarter of the wealth of white families, accumulated wealth, in the United States. And so what happens is if you're going to break that poverty gap, if you're going to begin to attack the wealth gap, what you would need to do is have African Americans in upper middle class positions in the United States. Now, that's sort of a slam dunk. We understand that. Does that mean basic structural change? No, it doesn't. And we shouldn't oversell it. Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice, got where he was because of affirmative action. Let me give you an example. I work with Anita Hill and kind of sort of know Anita Hill. And in 1991, way back then, before many of you were born, I had a discussion with a colleague who was black. And he said, oh, there's some problems with Clarence Thomas. But it was our shot. That was the black seat. And it was better to have a black man because we need representation. this word representation. Just go and represent. Just show up and your face speaks volumes. It was better to have Clarence Thomas, because if we didn't, if we let this woman destroy Clarence Thomas, then they would appoint a Hispanic, and we'd lose the black seat. So it was like a game of musical chairs. And I said, well, what I hear about Thomas is that he's extremely conservative, not a good friend of the black community. His representation, I'm just having a face there. What is the meaning behind the represent? What does a person represent besides just the epidermis? What's there? And the person said, no, it's just important to have representation. So we have Clarence Thomas. We're going to have other people like that. And we can say, well, they have a lifetime of experience. But my experience is not your experience. Just having people at the table doesn't mean that the dial moves in a more progressive direction. I know some very conservative black people who would love to benefit from affirmative action. But that doesn't mean they're going to lift as they climb. They're not. They're looking to enter the great American middle class and expand the black bourgeoisie. So I'm saying I support affirmative action, but I don't think it's a panacea. It's not. And affirmative action can be played with. I am a product of affirmative action, but I've suffered from that. I had a horrible experience when I was a young professor, and I was much more radical than I am now. I protested against the repatriation of something from a major university. Someone in another part of the university had asked that certain things be repatriated. And the unit that I was part of said yes, said no. And a senior professor, white, very senior and very old, said no. And I'll take these things and put them in my house, and the police will have to come and take them. I wrote a minority report, and someone said, you're really playing with fire. You know that your department has 3 Negroes. They don't need you. So anyway, life went on. I was fired. And then it turns out that a friend of mine who was very well known left, and he never explained. And the one black person they kept was sort of blonde and blue-eyed, and most people don't know he's black. And many years later, sort of a couple years ago, my dear friend from this particular job, we were on the phone, and he said, is so-and-so still there? And I said, yeah, as far as I know. Did he ever write anything? I said, as far as I know, no. And so this was a kind of sad commentary on affirmative action. Racists had picked and chosen. Yeah, racists had picked and chosen. A person who normally wouldn't have been qualified, but the person who was based, go along politician. And so affirmative action involves also white choices. What kind of black person do they want in a position, whether it be Clarence Thomas or this kind of unproductive slug. And what we have is not musical chairs. Well, sometimes musical chairs. You choose a black person over another black person, or you play off a Hispanic against a black person, or black person against Hispanic. I'm very sorry that the Supreme Court has ruled this way, though, because it means that the selected institutions, which many of the talking heads on TV went to, will have less black people. And that's not good. To me, affirmative action is a step. It's not social justice. So what will happen is we will have a situation. We can't have quotas. We will have a situation in which, as we know, happened in the California system, where black enrollment can go down by 40% or more. It's pancake. That is something I don't want to see. At the same time, and I'll be quick, Tim Scott, who's a Republican, which is not my party. Tim Scott is a black senator, has said what we need to do is put more emphasis in vocational education. Now, in my day, vocational education was viewed as, the second or third runner-up to a real education. And at my university, one of the first, Harvard said it had, the first affirmative action. I think Brandeis might be well ahead. Brandeis has a lovely program to get people who otherwise wouldn't go to university, to get them in. Now, how many graduate has always been a problem for me. Because you get them in and you tell the feds, look, we took in these people. But at the other end of the process, how many of these people have graduated? That's a problem. Retention and graduation. That's important. We're talking at a very high level on TV, blah, 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 on the Supreme Court. But even if we had very good affirmative action, how many of those people would actually graduate and go on and actually generate black wealth and enter the black bourgeoisie? Not my favorite group. And also, many years ago, I had a run-in with a person that I found very pleasant. At my university, a Professor McWhorter, who's now at Columbia, was invited, and he had written a number of little books, conservative books. And in one of them, he sort of said, even the liberals who support affirmative action and remediation, they know that this isn't going to do anything. And he said that in the book. So he came to my school, and it happened that the group that invited him, because someone's mother had heard him on TV. This is why I always like to see the thing for myself. Someone's mother had seen this man and said, oh, he'd be great. He's a good talker. So he came to give us a talk. And it was about vouchers. Basically, he wanted to talk about voucher systems, which most of our students could care less about. And I had his book. I read his book to get prepared. And I'd seen that he said it was sort of silly for old white people to run around and get unqualified young black people who should be in the trades. So as he talked, he finished, and I, being myself, opened his book and read a very inflammatory passage where he said most of these blacks would do better in the trades, and that when he needed a cable guy, he pretty much knew that the cable guy was not going to be black. And when he needed a plumber, and when he needed a whole series of people, the people showing up would not be black. And what should happen, this group would be better served by integrating them in the trades, them working through the trades, and making $35, $40, $50 an hour. But I read this because he wrote it in a very inflammatory way, that this was sort of silly, that these people were not prepared. And so pandemonium broke out. I didn't mean for that to happen, because the students began to ask the questions. Did you really say that? And he became very defensive and said, yes, I said that. Class is a fact. And that some people are simply not made for tertiary education, not meant for higher education. He left fairly quickly. We have not spoken since then. He may have had a point, but I think the point was put in a very insulting way. I do believe that African Americans need to be put in all sectors of American society. So I have a sibling who went to Harvard. All praise, all glory. But I also, and I be quite brutal, I have two cousins, whom I call my nephews, who didn't really want to go to university and didn't want to pursue higher education. And they got really good jobs. One as EMT, fireman, moving up the ranks. And the other one, I'm going to shock you, shock you, the other one became a policeman. Not something I wouldn't recommend. But anyway, he's doing it. And they are living these very nice California lives in these very nice, middle income neighborhoods. And they've chosen a life path that's not open to a lot of African Americans, it turns out. Or not, where they live is basically working class whites and immigrants. But the wealth they're going to pass on to their children is probably significant. And so my view is the Supreme Court made a big mistake. I hope that a future court reverses its position, the position of the court now, and that we figure out other ways to integrate the elite institutions. At the same time, I am not, and as I see all the talking heads on TV, these African-American talking heads who came out of someone's elite institution, they are not the future of the race. On that note, I want to conclude, and we shall have questions.
What could be done to improve affirmative action in the U.S.?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. I think that what could happen is that universities could look at diversity. They could diversify. They could say, we're looking for more diverse geographically and in class terms. So they could say, we're looking at class and not just at race. So that, and the problem with this, people say, well, there are far many more poor white people. Well, that's just going to happen, all right? But you could say, we're looking for people who make an income, whose families make an income less than, and who grew up in, you can combine it, who grew up in neighborhoods which have poor sewage, which have no water, the water has lead in it. I mean, you can create a class profile, the class and socioeconomic profile, that's going to bring in a lot of people and probably bring in a disproportionate number of Black folk. And you could base it on class and condition rather than epidermis. And so we often have this argument, well, I've heard whites say, well, if Oprah had children, well, they would get affirmative action. Well, the point is, if we start looking more at class, then we obviate some of those questions. And we combine class with neighborhood, because Black neighborhoods are different. It's like, if you live in a census tract, which is very, very poor, and your family makes $19,000 a year, you get a benefit, a diversity benefit, and it's not based on race. Okay, so the court is not saying, well, it's based on race. No, it's not based on race. It's based on socioeconomics, but socioeconomics which reflect themselves through race. Okay, that's my answer.
Okay, the second question is how to address the racism around affirmative action.
Well, I think that's going to remain because the U.S. is not the most racist country on the face of the earth. I don't like hyperbole. I don't like the idea of the original sin, because the original sin is it's not U.S. I mean, slavery extended from Canada to Argentina. Just look it up. It's easy. Okay? And it wasn't pretty. So we live in a country where racism is a constant. I believe that racism shifts and morphs. Okay. So that the problem, and I think Isabel Wilkerson pointed it out in her book Caste, is that as we go forward, those people who make it through, okay, to the middle class, because Americans don't like to use the word working class, they will begin to increasingly, I'm going to shock you, face less overt racism. And that caste in the United States, which is surrounded by endogamy. Americans, white and black, don't like to talk about that. But the Supreme Court this year, the Supreme Court of the United States said that sodomy laws and miscegenation laws were evil. And they, the federal government said, we must never have those again. Well, the idea of interracial sex being the same as anal sex is an American obsession. Sodomy laws, miscegenation laws, but still there are various prohibitions, and people live in one neighborhood, etc. Wilkerson pointed out in her book that gradually more people are going to go across the color bar, the racial bar in the United States. This will happen, but that doesn't mean that racism towards African Americans as a group diminishes. It could be, okay, I have a friend, I have a neighbor, they're all right, but those other people, those are the bad ones. And the problem is, what happens in the United States, and I don't have an answer, neither did she, if there's a residuum, there's a leftover group that's left out of opportunity. So that, let's say in 20 years, we've had 2 black presidents, and we have sort of proportional representation in Congress, but we also have a lot of people in intergenerational poverty, people who have poor services, people who have poor schools, but you also then have a lot of people who've made it. And so the society will say, it's not really race. So racism might morph to saying, it's not race. It's just the people are not making it. We don't know why. Immigrants make it, but they don't. There's something wrong with them. African immigrants have some of the highest educational attainments in the United States. And so you could have a situation where the society would say, solve that problem. My daughter-in-law is from Uganda. But I don't know about Shaquita from the projects. Don't want it. And so that is the problem. How do we really deal with the products of slavery? In other words, the sequela, the leftovers, where people are so excluded, and racism shifts, and it says it's not racism. It's just that they're not achievers. That is the problem. I don't have an answer, because I think that's going to happen. I think that in the next 30 years, people will say, well, no, the Africans have done so well. So-and-so has done so well. And we end up in a situation in which we're blaming the victim. In other words, we have victims of systemic racism who haven't been able to grasp the bottom rung on the ladder of opportunity. And that's our challenge. I want to thank all of you for being here today. Today is July 4th, the Independence Day of the United States. It's a day that many people celebrate. Other people are now criticizing as a day in which, basically the colonists revolted for their own selfish ends, including slavery. That could be. We'll talk about that later. But I wish those of you who are enjoying the holiday continue to enjoy. To me, it's another day. I hope to see you soon. I wish to thank my able editor, Pedro Enrique, my editor, and my assistant, who does an excellent job. Until we meet again, thank you.